Right. Welcome, everybody. Welcome back to everybody who was here yesterday. Welcome to those who are here for the first time. Our title for the morning, for this final session of The Pulse of Ukraine, is Investing for the Future. How to create jobs while curbing climate change and corruption. And I think corruption will be very much the focus of this, the sort of backdrop to so much of what the backdrop that undermines so much of the efforts to get real democracy, real transparency into the system. I remember, I think 2 years ago, I met a former head of the intelligence service here in Ukraine, and we were discussing before a conference, what is the greatest threat to Ukraine? Is it the war in the East? No, he said, it's corruption. Greater than the war, the threat of corruption is undermining our belief in the institutions and the democracy we have. And we have a wonderful panel to discuss those twin challenges, corruption and climate change, the things that could undermine really building stable democracy and a prosperous system here. Anastasia Krasnosilska, hi Anastasia, has been involved in anti-corruption reform for a long time. Since 2016, she's been one of the leaders of the advocacy campaign for the creation of the High Corruption Court, Anti-Corruption Court in Ukraine. Until May 2019, she was head of advocacy programs of the Anti-Corruption Action Center, and recently has been appointed as a member of the Ukraine delegation to GRECO. Anastasia, welcome. Lada Roslitsky, sitting next to me, head of content for the Independent Defense Anti-Corruption Committee of Transparency International's Defense and Security Program. Transparency International, a wonderful organization that I remember when it was founded 20, 25, 30 years ago, and has really done an extraordinary job to raise awareness of corruption right across the world. And then we have two of our wonderful scholars here at the Democracy Study Center, Valeria Ishik and Kristina Borovkova. I probably got all the stress and pronunciation wrong. I'm going to ask each one of you just to tackle what you think, one, is the real challenge, and two, what to do about it. But just in 2 or 3 minutes, and then we'll get a debate going and involve everybody in the audience. If you want to speak for 5 minutes, you can. Anastasia, do you want to take the lead? Would you like to start off? Shall I give you my microphone? Is there a second microphone anywhere?
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure being here this morning, so thank you very much to everyone who found time basically to speak about corruption, which is my favorite topic on this beautiful Saturday morning. I actually love the way the topic is formulated, relating corruption to the issue of jobs, because in our opinion as anti-corruption experts, corruption is basically something that deploys us of the jobs we might have had if the economy was more open, which unfortunately it is not due to corruption. Basically, Ukraine, as you all know, started anti-corruption reform only in 2014, and by now I think we have a huge chance of becoming, if not global, then regional trendsetters in solutions for fighting corruption that actually work for developing countries. We've been testing European standards. I will address this later. None of them work for us, unfortunately. We've been testing specific Ukrainian solutions. We've been opening some new horizons here, and I really do think solutions we've tested and that worked in Ukraine have perspective of becoming at least of interest, if not a trend for developing nations. What am I talking about? First, I think it's very important when we talk about fighting corruption to avoid this discussion of what is more important, prevention or punishment. This discussion is very popular among academia. I'm definitely saying something horrible when I say please avoid this discussion, but in my opinion as a practitioner, this is basically counterproductive. It's obvious we cannot prevent in a body which is already rotten. It is also obvious that we cannot prevent when the price or when the risk of sanction and punishment is non-existent, basically. In Ukraine, we very much focused anti-corruption reform on punishment, investigation, and basically tackling high-profile corruption, and I still think this was a good solution. Other solution we took was to focus on creating institutions from scratch. Instead of, at least in terms of anti-corruption, instead of pursuing these comprehensive reforms like prosecutorial and judicial, for anti-corruption we chose the way of creating separate institutions. Specialized anti-corruption prosecutor's office, National Anti-Corruption Bureau to investigate. Now the system has been completed with creation of High Anti-Corruption Court. This was the strategy that worked. In 2014, I remember we were told that, well, prosecutorial reform will take place and all the prosecution, including Anti-Corruption 1, will be perfect, independent, able to do its job. Whether it happened, no, but at least thanks to the idea of creating separate institutions, we have this investigation for high-profile corruption. However, this approach is actually only working as a probably short or mid-term strategy, because unreformed prosecutorial system, judicial system, etc., takes over with time, and now we are on the stage when we cannot close our eyes on importance for comprehensive prosecutorial and judicial reform, for anti-corruption, for economy, for creating jobs, for bringing more investors in. Then about European standards. We're talking a lot of European standards. Of course, we are all fond of European standards. However, what we found out in anti-corruption reform, they don't always work, basically. Our problem in anti-corruption and judicial also reform was that we tried to adopt, for example, the approach of the Council of Europe that judges must be selected by the bodies where majority are judges. Sounds perfect for developed democracy, however, not actually working in a country like Ukraine that has never had independent judiciary. If we don't have these first judges to select their successors, if we didn't have this first independent judges, how on earth this approach is going to bring some new quality to the system that has been rotten for more than 30 years? Therefore, we basically tried another solution, a very specific Ukrainian one, and it worked. I still think that this is our major, I would say, major goods for becoming a trendsetter. We employed internationals for basically participating in decision-making on appointment of key people to judicial system, prosecutorial, investigative, etc., and this approach worked. We were told 3 years ago that that's impossible because sovereignty, because language issue, because local context. This all proved false. We have had internationals with, basically I may say, with decision-making powers in selection of judges of High Anti-Corruption Court. It worked. It gave us what I see as the best result in selecting judges for probably past 5 years of attempt of judicial reform. I will probably at this point stop here because I was asked to address issues that worked and lessons learned, and I will be happy to engage in discussion and probably to give more focused solutions on what to do on local level, but after everyone else has their time with Mike. Thank you so much.
But Anastasia, I want to come back to you just for a second before I go to Lada. To define a little bit more what the problem is, because it strikes me that, crudely put, there are two forms of corruption. There is big corruption and there is small corruption. And in a way, small corruption can be like a disease. It spreads through the system. You can't get anything done without a little bribe here or a little bribe there. It's the sort of corruption that is rampant in a country like Greece, for example. You cannot get a driving license without making a payment. You cannot get an appointment with the doctor and so on. Now that's one form of corruption, which is usually built up around, often around a bureaucracy. You have to get the right form, a little payment here. But if you deal with that and don't deal with the big corruption, that's to say, the entire system of oligarchy, where actually the fundamental power centers of the economy are owned by a very small number of people, can you ever get rid of, or can you treat them separately? Are they two quite separate things? How would you answer that?
We'll try issue by issue. First, we do have opinion polls that show us what Ukrainians think of what is a bigger problem, high-profile corruption or petty corruption. If I'm not mistaken, up to 90% of the population think that corruption is one of the major problems on the agenda. But if you ask those people, what kind of corruption is a problem? Of them, I think it's up to either 60 or 70%, not sure, say it is high-profile corruption that affects situation in the country most. So we see people being more worried with high-profile corruption that may say waters out resources from the country, from the population, from the budget, from everyone in this room and outside this room, as opposed to petty corruption, which is not actually perceived as such a problem. In my opinion, I do think that, well, it's hard to prioritize from which we should start, but in my opinion, anti-corruption reform as such should be focused on high-profile corruption, whereas issues leading to petty corruption, like lack of resources in hospitals, for example, or a complicated system of achieving administrative services, that's not actually the issue of anti-corruption reform. This is about medical reform, social reform, reform of administrative services, etc. I do think that in past, for example, 5 years, we made a huge progress in reform of administrative services. I mean, I remember being a private entrepreneur and 10 years ago, basically 10 years ago, when I was standing in line for like 2 weeks without exaggeration, trying to get some minor papers processed. Now I don't actually even know where my tax office is because I'm doing all that online. So here, and I actually, there's no opportunity for my tax officer, I don't know who that is, to demand any kinds of bribe from me, simply because, well, we're not interacting in any way. By this, I'm simply trying to illustrate how petty corruption is more an issue of reform of administrative services and other services than basically the issue of anti-corruption reform. Whereas, again, anti-corruption reform, in my opinion, should be focused more on high-profile corruption, which is about identification, punishment, and of course, which is, well, not even punishment, but inevitability of punishments. Let's put it like this. Not about punishing everyone, but about letting everyone know that punishment will come if you do something wrong. And as to oligarchs, that's even more a complicated issue. This would be an issue of introducing more fair approaches to, for example, giving out licenses for extraction. For example, on better control, better prevention of monopoly in media sphere, etc. Very, very close to anti-corruption reform, but not limited to that again.
Ask if you would agree with that distinction, or how you see, first, what is the challenge here in Ukraine, and two, how do we deal with it? Can you do that?
I'm not a diplomat, but this answer will be but this answer will be diplomatic, yes and no. I agree partially. What is the problem? I would like to first go back to the oligarch question, because it's closely connected to political criminal relations and corruption. and not to undermine the problem, but if we look at the historical path dependency theory and analyze the creation and the history of states, states have a history when they were born, that they were actually the result of, states as we know them today, they were the result of raidership. And men would ride in on horses, burn down villages, and collect taxes for protection. And Ukraine, in numerous books and researches, actually fits into this period where we have to be addressing the oligarchic issues and the structures, but also recognize that this is not a unique situation or phenomenon. What is unique in Ukraine as it pertains to the oligarchic system is right before the panel started, Quentin mentioned that, well, it seems, my wife told me, I think he said, I'm not sure, that countries that have been colonized, or the citizens of countries that have been colonized, seem to have a little bit less of a problem with corruption, because the corrupt activity is actually undermining the government, which is a very serious activity. In Ukraine and post-Soviet states, we have something that is called the post-Soviet political criminal nexus, which dates back still, the crux has started in 1953 with the death of Stalin, where the Soviet economy was completely bankrupt, and they had to turn to something called the Vorenzakone, which are basically internationally organized criminals, to get money to keep the system up. That having been said, I would like to frame it, because we do have very limited time, and the topic is about corruption, and I would like to say a few words about the interstices with environmental degradation and the way that the environment suffers. Without going into very many case studies, I would like to tell you about one that pertains directly to separatism in Donbass. One time I was in Shell, in the company in The Hague, interviewing a gentleman with questions pertaining to shale gas in Ukraine. And he brought to my attention the fact that certain political criminal powers were actually being used to set up environmental organizations to protest against the shale gas. And these NGOs were connected to actually the special services of the Russian Federation. So this was one way that a good thing, like, yes, let's save the planet and not have shale gas done incorrectly, was abused. In my capacity as the head of content at NACO, which is the Independent Defense Anti-Corruption Committee, we are a research-based advocacy group, which means we first identify the critical problems inside of the system. Then we do really in-depth research in order to identify the corruption risks, which do not only pertain to the people and their perceptions, but really the juridical gaps that create possibilities for corruption. And one of the aspects that we're dealing with right now is defense real estate corruption. Ukraine has very many problems pertaining to the land that belongs to the Ministry of Defense. The Ministry of Defense does not have effective control over the territory that is supposed to be under its effective control. This is a direct problem for NATO integration, so Euro-Atlantic integration, because it invokes something called the Tallinn criteria. And the Tallinn criteria basically say if the MOD of a given country does not have effective control over the territory that it's supposed to have, you can't join. You can't join. And we're now analyzing a number of cases which is very tricky, and today I will be speaking with politicians concerned with this, that, for instance, Kryvyi Rih has an airport which has been polluted by gasoline and kerosene flying around all these airplanes. So what has been done is a deal has been made to plant sunflowers in order to clean this land. But this territory that has gone to clean the land with these sunflowers is about 10,000 hectares of land, which is ridiculous. And these seeds are being sold. So basically, businesses are being set up on these territories, and the seeds that are coming out, or the plants, are then being sold onto the market. So, okay, I don't think that the entire territory is polluted, and possibly it is necessary to have a local cooperation to identify, look, if we do have land and if it's possible to grow something here, then the localities should cooperate with the Ministry of Defense and the obviously at the Oblast region in order to really identify which land is necessary for the MOD, which land should actually be handed over to the localities, and what is really environmentally degraded and dangerous. We have many cases, but I think that I've given you enough to start.
Okay. Right, okay, super. We've actually got the sheer complexity of the picture emerging, but also you touch on a very interesting thing. Property ownership is actually still quite fluid in this post-Soviet world, and that's clearly part of it. Let me bring in Christina next to say, what does corruption mean to you? How does it affect you? And have you heard from our two speakers ideas that you think are going to work, or do you think it goes much, this is in a way in everybody's head?
Thank you for giving me a word. I think it's it's quite a difficult question, and I'm going to answer it. And also, I would like if you give me time to shed some light on the anti-corruption and corruption progress in Russia, as there is a striking news. 4 days ago, Russian government accepted a law that would cover and would hide some information from the official register about companies who were registered in Crimea and in Simferopol, and some companies who were also working with in security, in defense, and companies who were under sanctions. So the progress about anti-corruption fight in Russia is quite a difficult one, but I think that with these actions that state government is trying to harder to fight with corruption, it should start with us. As you have mentioned, there is a different types of corruption. For example, because I think that the problem with small corruptions starts that people want to see that government is working under corruption, and they want to see the results. And that's why there is a high demand, I don't know, maybe in Ukrainian society, but in Russian society there is high demand to see, okay, he's corruptionate, so let's sue him. But the government punishes people who were corrupted, but it's like just a measure of finding someone who had fallen from disgrace. It's like it's not like yes, all maybe there is a lot of people who were corrupted, but they choose one and said, okay, he will be our scapegoat, and I see that this demand in Russia exists. So people just don't want to start from themselves, because, for example, in some regions of Russia, for example, in the Northern Caucasus, you could not get a maternity capital, or you could not get a disability pension before you give some money in advance. So it's like this problem exists. So people could just stop this process, and but I don't see such interest to stop the corruption in places and locality. So for me, corruption is the sign that institutions do not work. And for me, corruption is just an easy way to get what you want when you don't want to give to go straight, like a normal to use normal procedure. And is it so?
Thank you for your question. It's quite hard to answer this question for me personally because I'm a civil servant and I can't elaborate very much on political issues. So practically I prepared more information about climate change and how I work with this issue and corruption in academic integrity, and if you allow me, I won't elaborate much on political issues. Okay? Thank you. Yep.
In the middle of his speech, he suddenly switched from talking about pollution. He said, but what I'm talking about is a system that tolerates pollution, is a system that has no belief in the individual and the human being. And there is one organization in this country, and he was talking about the Soviet Union, that more than any other illustrates that disregard for the individual. And that organization lives in the Lubyanka. And then he spent 20 minutes going at the KGB. You've never seen anybody look so uncomfortable as Gorbachev sitting in the middle of this. And what I didn't realize was that this giant on crutches was actually a national hero. He was the gold medalist from the Olympics 4 times in weightlifting, and he'd broken his back. So it was like your national sports hero going for... But what he did was this fascinating thing of linking pollution with not believing in the individual. Let me just leave that story there, and you tackle the issue of the problem of environmental damage. Yeah?
As far as I work in the Ministry of Education and Science, we also partially touch the topic of teaching young people how to treat this topic in terms of new Ukrainian school reform that we has launched in 2017, and climate competence was one of those framework competences that were put in this reform. But unfortunately, we didn't find any partner who could help us with boosting this topic at schools. It was a total disaster for us that when we found a lot of partners, Austrians, from Denmark, from Netherlands, from Poland, who were more than happy to help us with civil society competences, with academic integrity, but nobody could help us with these climate change issues. And we realized that we have a big problem in Ukraine when the responsibility for teaching young people of how to treat these 21st century issues as climate pollution and different other type of air pollution, water pollution, is dispersed among 5 ministries, and nobody is directly responsible for this issue. So if we talk about reform, that the aim of reform as individual who is responsible for its environment, for its community, its state, we still can't find solution how to approach particular environment issue. And recently we asked Finland to help us with this particular topic, and they promised to give us external help on this issue, because they are very, very famous with their approach, how children grow up in their absolutely environmentally friendly education system, when all the materials that surrounds them are totally natural, when teachers approach every topic, no matter what is the subject, from the climate change perspective. So they decided to help us for the next 3 years, in addition to already existing project of Finnish help for New Ukrainian School. As an additional component, environmental changes as a new approach for teaching how to approach these issues at schools. So, and I guess this is the first step that we already done. That is. I guess it will be very helpful in the next 5 years, when we have a new government and a new minister who will be ready to accept that we were ignorant about this issue. We just wrote it in every document, every legal document, but practically did nothing for that. So we finally have this idea. Like a part of our mindset, but we still have a very long road to finally start doing something in this issue. And I'm very happy that we already had 3 Friday for Future meetings in Ukraine, but only 100 children were there on these meetings, on these peaceful meetings, and nobody accepted the idea to replace the last day of our 11th grade, when our children finish school. Replace it with some actions for climate. This is also a very negative impulse for us, and it gives us a lot of thought, a lot of food for thoughts. But still, as I mentioned before, I really think that the new government with new people will approach this issue in a brand new way, because a lot of youngsters, millennials, will be there in the government.
Let me just ask one question. You will be aware of the campaign coming from Sweden. What's her name? Thunberg. Yeah. Children going out from school and literally going on strike 1 day a week in demanding more action on climate change. Has anything like that come here yet? Is there any similar, if you like, militancy in that school-going generation?
As I said, we have already three peaceful demonstrations here in Ukraine. We have a Ukrainian group in Facebook, Friday for Future Ukraine. We don't have very vivid leader of this movement in Ukraine among children, but philosophy that Sternberg started in Switzerland is really very fast spreading in Ukraine here. But as I already said, we don't have environment and support from the government side to agree and to express approval of all those actions that already done by those 100 children.
That's the whole point. You don't wait for government support. You say, we're going to act. I'm going to give the microphone to Lada to come in.
Thank you. Valeria, the way that you started your presentation concerns me. As a civil servant, you do have a freedom of speech, and it is corrected and protected. That having been said, in Ukraine, it's fantastic that all of you are here, because last year we have a new national security law that empowers you in something that is called democratic oversight and control. As members of the government, civil servants, starting from the president all the way down to grassroots organizations, you have a right to access to information pertaining to, i.e. the environment. You have a right to speak about it. You have a right to demand from the government changes. But having been said, also it's very important to continue doing what you are doing in organizing. And if you would like, in the future, I could probably put you in touch and help you to deal with a little bit more of the communications aspect. Facebook is great, but you need to have a little bit more media maybe, or if you like, we can meet sometime in the future. Okay.
Thank you very much for the question. This is basically the key question. No shortcut here, no simple answer. How do we get people making it clear for the government that it's enough? I will probably, if you allow me, return to the question you asked on support for our President Zelensky. 73% of Ukrainians voting for a person with zero political experience, but accumulating lots of hope. It's, well, I think it's not particularly Ukrainian situation. I think with that we fall into some global trend of yes, exactly, of nations, communities, people feeling that political system as it is does not meet their needs and hopes anymore. So that's again not unique for Ukraine. I think 73% for Zelensky was not only about corruption, but basically of all the hopes that were not implemented, that were very high but were not implemented in past 5 years, and now it's a huge challenge to basically deal with this 73% of the population whose support might as easily turn into being, well, what's the antonym for support? I can't even find, well, not sabotage, but not even opposition, but outrage. So that's a societal challenge as well. We were talking about, well, what would be the choice for Ukrainians, whether to engage into petty or not that petty corruption or not. Actually, opinion polls show us that for ordinary Ukrainians, this is a very rational issue. So people tend to choose what is, as you said, what is easier and what is cheaper. When it is easier and cheaper, to follow the rules, people do. It's not that people love to pay bribes. They do follow the rules when it's simple, cheap, and effective, ending with result they want for. When it is cheaper, safer, easier to go with corruption, well, then people do, and again, still believe in their impunity, as impunity of high-profile politicians teach them that, well, that's the case, everything will be fine, just go with what is better for you. The same, I think, basically applies to this issue of, how to put it correctly, of overlooking, for example, climate issue as connected to overall low respect of the rule of law. These two issues are actually very, very closely linked, because we do have some legislation on ecology and how business should actually fit all these ecological standards, but since rule of law and again obedience to the rules and risk of punishment is very low, they're simply not obeyed, and that's it. And this applies not only to climate change, but unfortunately to all issues under regulations of the government, and that's the challenge. Therefore, this is basically why I'm saying that inevitability of punishment is something that, from which, in my at least opinion, changes start in all areas, starting from corruption, medical services, ecology, and everything else.
You put your finger on a very important point there, which is that if it's actually cheaper and easier to obey the rules, people will obey the rules. And so getting the right rules is a key part of that. Now, I remember what was happening in Georgia when Saakashvili was there. Saakashvili made many mistakes, and I think one of the mistakes was he dealt with small corruption, but not big corruption. But he had this extraordinary advisor and minister called Kaka Bendukidze, who basically created a bonfire of regulations, because he said, all this red tape, all these regulations are actually providing opportunities for corruption, because it was easier for people to bribe their way past the rules. And so he scrapped the rules. He went to the borders, and they had something like 1,000 different tariffs on imported goods. And the borders were notoriously corrupt, because you had to pay and then you avoided the tariff. So he said, okay, well, the answer is 0 tariffs. And everything speeded up at the borders, the trucks were going through, it was quite dramatic. And the other thing he did was greatly reduce the number of petty regulations that the police had to enforce. So again, getting rid of that. Now, is something like that the answer here, or is something being done? Christina, is, getting rid of all the silly regulations that are unnecessary, is that the answer? Do you have a microphone?
Yes. It's like there is in Russia, maybe in Ukraine, there is a proverb that the state should not help us, just do not hinder us. Because due to a lot of state regulations, businesses, for example, could not grow. And yes, I think it could be a possible solution in diminishing all these state regulations, especially towards businesses. And for example, in Russia there is a problem of the Soviet standards norms, GOST. And for example, for businesses, it's like, as I remember correctly, there is a problem that in one business you should have 2 or something windows to be hidden, to be directed to west and to east, in order for sun just to going around. So to have a lot of allied. I just don't remember what businesses. So there is a lot of such silly regulations that should be decreased in order to, for example, minimum to save life for businesses. So yes, I agree with you totally.
Valeria, let me come back to you, and I'm trying to make this, to get the linkage right, but I think the linkage is in the psychology, the linkage of people say no to more pollution, no to more environmental degradation, but equally no to the corruption in the system and so on. How do you change people's mentalities? And Lada's challenge to you in a way is to say, no, you don't say, where's my foreign partner or where's my new government minister? Actually, you get things moving without that happening, and then the foreign partner or might say, I'm going to have to do something about this. There is a real passion and desire to change things. Or is it hopeless? You just have to wait for that foreign partner, for that Finnish, bring us better standards from outside. Isn't it? Don't you need more anger from inside, your outrage, Anastasia, more outrage to say, we are going to change things?
I guess that there is no understanding among our citizens that climate change results and corruption has the same nature. And the nature is fast-track solutions. We give bribes because we would like to, for example, shorten the time for receiving some document. And we have the results of climate pollution because businesses and average citizens don't want to look for complicated answers to how to treat the world around him or her. So there is no idea in our today mindset that climate change and corruption are at the same stage, and there is no leader who will repeat this everywhere. Because I think that if you ask one, who is the leader of climate change agenda here in Ukraine? Okay, you will answer a few NGO like Україна без сміття, Зелений птах, three or four main organizations, NGOs, but they don't have majority. They don't have ear of average citizen. And I also didn't find air pollution or climate change issues in most of parties' documents that are going for elections. And this is my question also. Where is this question in our political agenda?
Come in from the audience now and actually wade into the debate. Or any questions out there? Are people getting angry enough about these issues? If ordinary voters and citizens don't demand change won't happen. Anybody like to come in on that? How do you get people angrier about these issues? Yeah? Okay, Christina, come in.
To give time to prepare, I just would like to underline that such issues as ecological issues, for example, in such democracy problem, a country like Russia, for example, if you don't care about about repressions, human rights, but what could inspire people to go to protest or to go to meeting or to in order to resist to government, was ecological questions, was questions about Khimkinsky forest, Khimkinsky les. Also, there were issues about garbage in Moscow region, and now there is a protest in Arkhangelsk region, Shies. So this people's reaction toward problems with garbage, with ecological questions, they could form the ground for democracy, for defending rights, and I think it's great that people becoming more conscious about ecology, and this is the way that they could, for example, to ask a government, what are you doing on this issue, because it's not acceptable for us to have garbage near our home, or we think that it could destroy environment. So I see this great plus, for example, for countries such like Russia.
Fine. Let me come to the audience here. Who wants to go first?
Let me be the first. Anastasia.
Stand up a bit and then we can all hear you.
Okay, I hope that the microphone will work so everybody will be able to hear me. Okay, so, well, in my personal opinion, I'm not sure that we need people to get more angry about that issues, because, well, I believe that we've got a lot of voters angry enough around the world, and that's and we've got a lot of outcomes, and not always positive because of that anger. I believe that people should be like educated and step by step lead forward to such changes towards their attitude to I don't know, greener or more sustainable life. For example, I've got very funny example of such way. In Western Ukraine, there are some communities where local priests, after the Pope of Rome made his resolution towards more about saving forests, and after that, some of Greek Catholic priests started in villages their campaign, telling people when they visit church to be more sustainable and at least to sort their garbage. And you know what? There was a really, really funny situation, because it's in the region where when I was born, so I know how it happened there for sure. So you know that mostly old people go to church. So could you imagine the situations? And mostly old people started to sort the garbage, and old people started teach and follow young people, and when they saw that young people didn't sort, they started persuading them to do so. So it's a totally different situation, because we know that in cities, for example, younger generation is the one that starts sorting and paying attention to such climate issues. What I'm trying to say that why should we work on people to become angry? We just need to try to find some channels for good communication and for showing them some small steps. And one more good thing that happened in those communities that I'm talking about, that local priests, that they made a union with local authorities and with companies, recycling companies, and those monies that were collected from that recycled garbage, they were used for planting trees and making parks in those areas. So they made the results visible and tangible in short perspective. So I'm sorry, but I don't agree with the thesis that we need people to become angry because of what is happening with climate, with our ecosystem. We need to find small solutions and agents of influence. Like, I'm not too religious, I'm a secular person, but in this particular situation, we can see how points of influence, how priests could become points of influence of something good. So we should look for such points of influence and for such small steps that different communities and people of different ages could do. So.
Okay, that's very nice. I like the idea of even the Pope can be on the side of the angels.
Thank you. My name is also Anastasia. I actually have few points. And first, I would also agree with Anastasia regarding making people angry. I think that's not the way, because the anger doesn't bring you far. It can start off, you can go on the street and protest, but I think there needs to be policy action afterwards and continuous demanding, because the anger keeps as long as people get disappointed and then they either leave or they give up on the topics. So I think it's better to build a sustainable, more policy oriented. But another point I wanted to tackle is rather also the topic, because I think we're trying to address how to create jobs, how to deal with climate change and corruption. And I think that's rather referring to what also the colleagues in the panel were mentioning, that we're trying to solve all the problem in one solution, in one panel. And I think that's also why maybe it's much harder, because I don't think we can address at the moment all this. Of course, they are interrelated, but I think they have to be addressed in a different, separately, even though taking into consideration the relation between them. And for instance, I think regarding, it's been a lot said about corruption, but with climate change, I think it's like such a big topic, but there is, besides what people do, there has to be incentives from the government, and I haven't seen it much in the agendas of the parties, but also the president campaign. And I would see that the way to address it would be to incentivize people. For instance, if people pay offsetting the carbon tax, like now the tickets for the flights are getting very cheap, so more and more people are traveling for the weekend. But how much information is on how much carbon footprint we are leaving if we go for a weekend trip to, I don't know, to Italy or somewhere else? So I think there has to be some incentives on a bigger scale level, that if people are paying the carbon taxes, I don't know, maybe that's too far as well, but to regulate it, that people become part of it. And I think here it's very important to have the cooperation between the government and the society. And of course, what was mentioned is education, but also infrastructure, because if we want people to go by bikes in Kiev, but then they're hit by a car, how can we ensure it? So I think just saying that people are using too many cars, or I don't know, eating too much meat, but there has to be an alternative. So I believe that the key is really bringing awareness, but also creating this relationship between the government and the citizens.
Okay, let me come back to the panel. I'll come back to Lada. I think that I hear very much what you say about outrage, which the word that I picked up on from Anastasia, but I think what we're talking about is a passion that is enough to get people engaged. There was a famous Irish poet, W.B. Yeats, who wrote an extraordinary poem at the time of Irish independence, and he wrote the line, "The best lack all conviction, and the worst are filled with passionate intensity." And he was worried that people who don't care were the ones who had the emotional engagement, and people who cared were just too passive. I'm going to put this on to Lada.
Just following up on both of your statements, I think that Ukraine has had a sufficient amount of anger which was expressed during Maidan, and a sufficient amount of sadness which is felt everywhere because of what is happening in our country. However, we do have a new national security law, and I call your attention to it because it is codified inside of Ukrainian legislation that democratic oversight and control. Every single ministry, including the Ministry of Environment, has something called a civil council, a Hromadska Rada. Currently, we're working from the defense sector, the defense and security, we're really hammering away on them because they too are extremely corrupt, and they too serve purposes that need to be changed. And young organizations or professional associations have a right to become members. If you don't want to become a member because it's not paid and it's a bunch of work, you have a right to submit yourselves as experts. And these Hromadske Rady are very powerful instruments. So there is hope, and the law is behind you.
Okay, Anastasia, how to get people engaged, perhaps without making them too angry?
Well, yes, actually, I do think that making people angry is not probably the best way of motivating Ukrainians again, because we have no problems with getting angry. I mean, when there are major problems, people do go on the streets and protest. For example, just when was that? Yesterday, the day before yesterday, when the notorious Mr. Portnov, who is just a symbol of establishing governmental control over judicial system, returned to Ukraine. Well, that was before, and was reappointed as a university law professor in Ukraine's leading university, Taras Shevchenko, and this caused massive outrage among students. They did protest, and well, in the end, he was not appointed, as far as, at least as far as I understood the situation. However, the problem here is not getting angry for one single problem, but sustaining this effort leading to some policy change, as you said. And this is actually a problem in Ukraine. I think less than 5% of Ukrainians are engaged in this or that NGO or community activity, which is actually a form of sustaining this, or rather transforming this anger into passion to get things changed. But then these groups may become uncomfortable for the government, and the government then refuses them money. The government then, after refusing them public money, calls these organizations grant eaters, grantayiedi, blaming them of bringing and basically misusing foreign funds, simply because these organizations become too uncomfortable for the government. So I think, again, the problem is how to sustain this public efforts aimed on whatever change we basically want to bring, starting from fighting corruption and ending up with climate change, or basically whatever, adopting homeless kids, whatever it can be.
Please, my comment will be very boring because, again, I switch it. My comment will be boring, but I can't comment. Stand from commenting this about partners. If there is no, if the issue is not in political or governmental agenda, there is no state budget for resolving some issue. And then partners is the only solution that we have. For example, 3 years ago, we didn't have any policy for inclusive education. We didn't have money in state budget for making new education environment that will help children with special education requirements to enter the classroom. That's the issue. That's why this was the moment where partners helped us before we finally lobbied that the budget for children with special education requirements was included into education subvention. And the same issue with climate change. If we will not have party that will lobby this issue, we will again fail climate change issue in the agenda of Ukraine. It's just because the Ukraine is transition democracy. This is how it works. We can't just be angry to finally launch some campaign or to launch some policy. It was okay. It was successful with Euromaidan, but if we repeat experience of Euromaidan again, it wouldn't be as successful as we had before.
Just a short remark here. I very much actually agree with Valeria, and I will try to explain this with a easy issue. Well, actually not an easy issue of cutting the use of plastic bags, for example. Lots of Ukrainians, when I say lots, I actually mean probably majority of Ukrainians still do not understand how important it is to finally stop using plastic bags from supermarkets. And while we are trying to find partners for media campaigns, while central TV channels are not interested in launching these media campaigns, while we are moving in very, very small steps, civilized European countries simply adopt legislation which bans using these plastic bags in like, when is that? I think it's in like 5, yes, I think, but the ban is about to come into effect in like few years, if I'm not mistaken. will we be, well, in a year actually, in a year and a half, will we be able to make that of a progress with our not even yet existent information campaign on plastic bags if the government doesn't take an action and simply say plastic bags are illegal from this moment? Of course, people will be like boo, 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 boo. They will be, but the issue will be taken and they will get used to it and the problem will be solved.
I still worry a little bit about the psychology of waiting for somebody else to take the first move. In supermarkets in my country, in Britain, there is it is the consumers themselves who are refusing to take stuff in plastic. And it takes a little while, and then you suddenly start to see the vegetables that are not wrapped in plastic are the more popular vegetables, even if they go off more quickly. They're moving with their habits. So now the supermarket I shop in, when you go to an automatic till, there are no bags. You have to bring your own bag in order to put stuff into it. Now, it didn't require a ban. Maybe some things do, that pushes people, but maybe we need to take more action from below to actually get things moving. And I think I remember, and I think there is a bit of we've all got the problem in our own countries. Where are the leaders? Who's going to take the lead? We need to take the lead sometimes. We need to get off our backsides and do something about it. But I remember in Germany, when I was a correspondent in Germany, I went to visit the uranium mining area in the former DDR. It is a terrible area of mining, destruction and pollution and everything. And I went on a visit with the Minister of the Environment, and the reaction was, at last, the minister is going to solve the problem. And actually, the real issue is, no, we've got to make the demands, we've got to make the cleanup. And Ukraine, of course, inherited devastated mining areas and filthy environment and so on, and most of which is, of course, now owned by very wealthy oligarchs who may not want to clean it up very much. So there's a challenge, but the ordinary people need to say, we're not going to do it. And the example that Olga was quoting of, it's there, the older generation is starting to sort their rubbish, little gestures. Now, I want to come at you. You had a question. Stop taking photographs and ask a question.
Okay, thank you. I want to come back to your topic about psychological aspect of corruption and how to make people angry. For sure, corruption is a very complicated problem, and it have a number of reasons. But if we will speak about psychological aspect, I think one of topics is tax paying. Nobody likes to pay taxes in Ukraine, so there are a lot of state-owned companies, for example, like hospitals, for example, state-owned services. They are provided for free, and people think that it's free, and they don't pay taxes, and they pay illegal money for doctors, for example, for appointed and to be appointed. And when people start to pay taxes, when this disorganized will finish, and people will realize that they are already paid for this, corruption on low level will be much more or less.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any questions from over here? Anybody want to come in just before we finish? We've got 5 minutes left. Then I'll come back to our panel. Yes, Christina.
Before we break, I would like to stress and to point out an issue about ecological question, because we now having a forum, and with our colleagues, for example, if we were talking about starting from us, we were pointing out and I address to you to raise a question about paper and plastic bags, plastic bottles we have here, for example, and also I would like to address to organizers to reduce using plastic cups and to replace them by ceramic cups, for example. And yes, so we could start just to stressing. We could start from us just to stressing the point that at events, at conferences, we could be more ecologically conscious, and this could be like our first step to to ecology. To be ecologically responsible person.
Just down the line of you, to ask each one of you, what can the other do for you, sort of idea. To ask Lada then, you know, here you are at Transparency International, a campaign about corruption. What support do you need, not from top down or anything, but from bottom up? What engagement do you need from ordinary people?
We need victims. We need human faces that will reach out to us, because we deal with very technical and sometimes scary matters. But people forget that children and women and men are direct victims of corruption inside of the security and defense sector. So if you know anybody, or you know anybody who wants to, like, is a whistleblower, please reach out, because we do network very well.
Well, perfect question, actually. As for me, I'm jumping into political career now, but I won't be doing any political campaigning now. What I kindly ask all you guys here to do is to check the website launched by Anti-Corruption Action Center, with which I worked for 3.5 years, and to check profiles of the members of parliament, compare those with, or to see whether any of those members of parliament are actually now running within single member constituencies where you are electing your representatives for the parliament, and see whether candidates that are offered in electoral menu for you now have voted for issues related to corruption before. On this website, it is called Sirpom.org.ua. We have collected profiles of members of parliament who now go for so-called majoritarian single constituency electoral districts, trying to get re-elected. Please check who is offered for you and whether these guys actually do have reliable profile or not. And please be conscious of what you elect for upcoming elections. Thank you so much.
I think my previous speech could be related to to my proposal to be more ecologically conscious.
Yeah, and my comment is very, very simple. I realized that I'd like maybe to launch some NGO or foundation that would be related with those young professionals who will come to their schools and try to persuade their school administration to lobby those issues that are not in the school curricula. We now don't have climate issues in school curricula, but each of us can just go to our schools where you studied and have few lections for those young school children that now go to your school. It's so simple, and this is truly down-up action that every one of us could actually do.
That's very good. I think I'll wrap up the debate, but I want to leave you with this thought. Very often when we think about democracy, people think about elections, political parties, voters. But let's just look at the election of your new president here, Zelensky. I said to somebody yesterday, how much difference is he going to make? And the answer came, you know, I think probably nothing will change very much, and in 5 years' time, or whenever it is, we'll kick him out and we'll bring in another new broom and nothing will change very much. Because actually democracy is everything between elections as well. It's actually keeping up the pressure. And I think that what I would say is that all democracy begins at the bottom and it should be people demanding better from the system, from themselves, and the only way they'll get that is actually to deliver it themselves, to get engaged in community action, and that's, of course, where pollution and environmental degradation, and also, I think, corruption, are issues that people will say, enough. We've had enough of this. We must engage. But not just at elections, but at everything between. And Valeria, what you're trying to do in the schools and getting schools engaged is fantastic. I've got 5 children. It's my children who drive me, not me really driving my children. They're the ones demanding what Christina is demanding. They're the ones saying, Dad, why are you still buying water in plastic bottles? You should be buying glass bottles, you know, and all of that. So actually, that's very good. I am delighted to see that, in a way, there is a younger generation getting engaged. And that's the most important thing, because the old have made an awful lot of mistakes. And I think it's up to you all to be putting right the mistakes we made. But by God, I'll do my best to help. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all, the panel, very much. This sort of wraps up our main action for the Pulse of Ukraine. I wonder, where is Barbara? Does she want to make any concluding remarks? She's slipped out. I'll bring her back in. Barbara, let me just wrap up though and say I think we've had a fantastic debate over the last day and a half with many very real issues of relevance, not just here in Ukraine or in Russia, Georgia, Moldova, but very much also to us too in all the rest of Europe. The issues of populism, the issues of how do we make our cities more cleaner, more lively, more engaged spaces, issues of the environment and issues of corruption, issues of culture and identity. All of these issues we've covered, which just shows the incredible range that you cover here at the Democracy Studies Centre. And out of small things will grow much bigger things. We need to build on all these small things. Barbara, would you like to make any concluding thoughts to the end of the forum?
General, thank you, because we are dependent on such good people, and we are working here very hard to be an asset to Ukraine. We have got very brilliant fellows who think and we will continue this program because we've got the next grant from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So we count on you as our supporters, and we hope that we will find important topics for the next academic year. And yeah, thank you so much for coming, for supporting our initiative, our center. We are having our discussion on Facebook, on live streaming, so that we decided to put our fellows here, because this is for them mostly, yes. So thank you so much, and I think it was a great discussion. We were observing it from the room next to it, the big screen, but it's a little bit, I'm suffering under the heat, so for you was a little bit better to sit there. It was very interesting. And Quentin, once again, thank you for this incredibly great moderation yesterday and today. So for your support, thank you so much. And that was, I hope that you will be able to reach your goals for the next. And then we hope, what yesterday said, that I wish that young Ukrainians will not be disappointed choosing the young next president, and then as the first one who will really realize his ambitions and what he promised. Yeah, to the young, that they will be not disappointed. Right? Thank you so much. Thank you.
Paul, would you like to say any last word from a mayor engaged, what you've heard here? do you come away, Rafał, do you want to have a quick word? Yes, Rafał's the former mayor of Wrocław and also one of the inspirations for this forum.
But I am not really talkative. Therefore, just one sentence: "Future belongs to you." This is what I am really thinking.
Right. That's perfect. That sums it up. The future belongs to you all. Thank you very much. And Barbara, thank you very much for organizing this wonderful forum. Because it has been, and for all our speakers, some of whom have already departed again for America or Germany or wherever they've come from, it's just a fantastic, and every single one of them said, this is a wonderful opportunity to come to Ukraine, to visit Kiev, to see what you're talking about, just as much as for you to hear what we talk about, because the future is yours. Thank you, Rafał, for that thought, and thank you all. Yeah.